technical seminars are an Intertech production. For instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.
If you have any history or experience working with classic ASP pages, you know, the old active server pages and VB script, remember how we were in charge of our state? We were in charge of the exact output that should be sent to the client? This stuff here is going to look familiar to you. You're going to look at this and say, yeah, this looks really familiar. I don't know if I want to go down this route. I'll show you here in a little bit. If you haven't had time to sharpen your C# or VB skills with the lambda operator, working with link, partial methods, and then of course the entity framework, well, this is going to be important for working with the model portion of MVC. Again, keep in mind the model portion is entirely up to you. It's the code that you put in there that's actually going to request the data, and of course the entity framework is being rewritten completely with .NET 4.0. Yeah, you will have to learn this stuff eventually, and this is something that C# and VB developers will have to contend with and get to know. So, some of the things I've already mentioned. This is just comparing web forms to MVC. Hey, web forms, if you've been doing ASP.NET, you already know this stuff, right? But over on the MVC, you gotta start from scratch. An entirely new model that you must learn, right? You like working with server controls, you're going to want to stick with the web forms world. However, in MVC, you're generally working with raw JavaScript and HTML. Automatic state management, well, we get that with web forms. We have manual state management in the MVC world, where we have to manage the state of all of our controls on our web pages ourselves. We still do have access to the session and application and things of that nature, the cache objects. We have access to the intrinsic objects, if you will, but we don't have access to like view state, for example, because that stuff is automatically done by ASP.NET Forms. Dragging and dropping controls, yeah, that's something we do in Visual Studio all the time, right? You drag and drop a button, a cool calendar control. Well, just basically take those controls and ignore them. You can't use those anymore in the MVC world. Instead, you're in charge of creating your own HTML. Now, if you want to create your own custom controls for MVC, well, then you're going to be creating your own code pieces that are going to be compiled or referenced from your MVC pages that will ultimately emit the HTML and the JavaScript. ASP.NET Web Forms have been around since 2002, and they've been tested extensively and used extensively, whereas 1.0 was officially released April 9th, 2009. So it's less than a year old at the time of this recording. And of course, it's weak or a custom TDD was required. There wasn't much test-driven development available for web forms. However, it's encouraged and included with MVC. And honestly, test-driven development is one of the reasons that developers choose MVC over the regular web forms. They found it impossible to test the individual ASPX files and the code behind files. They found it impossible to create unit tests. But with MVC, it's much, much easier because you can just go ahead and test directly against the public methods and of the classes. You can choose exactly what you want to test. A lot of developers, for example, won't test the actual views, but they'll test the controllers, they'll test the routes, and they'll test the models as well. As you can see, both frameworks are still supported in Visual Studio 2010. I'm currently using Beta 2 on my own machine, and of course I still have Visual Studio 2008 for real world, because being that Visual Studio 2010 is in beta, I'm not going to go ahead and create all my applications in that. And of course you also have access to all the provider models that make up ASP.NET. First off, if you want to get into MVC, you've got to download it. And you can also download all the source code if you want to all of the different DLLs, if you will, that make up MVC, and you can make changes to it because you own the code. You can do what you want with it. Something new from Microsoft is they are now really embracing the open source model. They are embracing this open source model, meaning like MVC, of course, is completely open source, and Ajax is open source. Ajax Control Toolkit, the Ajax library. A lot of these different source code or source projects are available from the Codeplex website. Codeplex.com actually is a completely open source community where people can go ahead and submit projects completely open source, or they can download open source solutions that have been developed by many different folks across the world. And of course, MVC is located there as well, and you can just navigate to ASP.NET.Codeplex.com to download the source code to MVC. jQuery, a JavaScript library, is now going to be included with ASP.NET. It's also included with the MVC framework. jQuery, again completely open source, was not something that was created for ASP.NET developers. It was instead created for all web developers. jQuery is an open source JavaScript library that anybody can use to go ahead and refer to certain controls on a given page. It allows you to saves you plenty of JavaScript coding if you need to access certain controls and work with their individual properties or events and stuff. It uses kind of a markup that's similar to CSS, cascading style sheets, for your actual HTML elements. jQuery is being included with Visual Studio 2010 and with this MVC project template. And like I said, it's completely open source. Microsoft is not rewriting the jQuery library. They are including a Visual Studio version just so that you get these really cool tooltips and IntelliSense in the actual editor, but they are not in charge of modifying jQuery, but instead are working closely with the actual jQuery team, the people who write the jQuery library, which again is completely open source. So they want to have that as part of our web projects going forward. If you've been doing any web projects or you're going to be working with ASP.NET in the future, it's going to do you wisely to, it's going to be advantageous to you to learn jQuery because it's going to be everywhere with ASP.NET. I know there's other JavaScript libraries out there. For example, you might be using Prototype with Scriptaculous, some of the other ones that are available, but know that jQuery is the one that Microsoft's including with their new web project templates and also the MVC template. Now, if you just want to download 1.0, you can certainly navigate to the ASP.NET site, which will bring you back to a download link on Microsoft's homepage. They've also got a new web installer, you may have noticed. When you go to the ASP.NET site and you download some of the newer templates, it'll actually run this special installer in your machine, download it, and install it right into Visual Studio all through the web. It's pretty cool. Remember that last bullet point at the bottom, guys. You can only use MVC with web application projects, not websites. It's funny how Microsoft has almost got themselves stuck here by introducing websites of Visual Studio 2005, and then they've gone back to web application projects because developers demanded it. Web application projects is what we've had since Visual Studio 2002, basically since .NET was released, and now they're having to carry both architectures forward, even today in Visual Studio 2010. MVC will be released with Visual Studio 2010, which has an official launch date. If it hasn't already occurred when you're watching this, March 22nd, 2010 is when they're going to be releasing the new versions of Visual Studio 2010. And it's going to be different versions of these Visual Studio environments. I know in the past we've had these team editions and professional. Now we're going to have this new version called Ultimate. So we'll be learning about the new versions of Visual Studio as they come out. Project template right now is available in Visual Studio 2010 Beta 2. Mind you, if you still have Beta 1 installed on your machine, you may have noticed that MVC is not part of that Visual Studio environment. That's because the official lock-in date for Beta 1 of Visual Studio 2010 did not include that release of MVC 1.0. So we always had to make a separate download and install it into that beta, in the Beta 1 of Visual Studio 2010.
For more free learning resources and to see the latest lineup of our instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.